Welcome to Workplace Justice. From injuries to compensation, our experts have you covered.
Welcome to Workplace Justice with Dan Davis. I'm Sam Henniger, and I'm excited to get to chat with Dan, getting to know him and his journey as an attorney so far. So, Dan, welcome to the show.
Hey, Sam, how are you?
Doing well. To get things started, I'd love for you to describe an interesting journey, I think, at least from you being a police officer to becoming a practicing attorney specializing in wage and hour claims.
I hadn't thought about until recently how that my experience as a police officer affected and kind of shaped my choices and ultimately what I do now as an attorney. I was a police officer in the late 90s, early 2000s in Tallahassee, Florida. Two things there, I think, have kind of shaped me into what I'm doing today. One is that it was my first exposure to the legal system. You know, it was criminal law, but at the same time, it was the first time I ever had a chance to really see how the courts interact with the public and how our laws shape the way we kind of behave in society. And that it really did get me interested. I got to see as a police officer attorneys doing their jobs, and I was fascinated by that. I think the second thing that experience, the second way it affected me was that at the time in Tallahassee, we didn't have any Spanish-speaking police officers, and I've always been very interested in languages. I ended up taking time off, some leave from the department to go overseas to a couple of different countries to start learning Spanish specifically so that I'd be able to come back and speak Spanish to the people in our community as a police officer. And as a result, when I became an attorney and was able to speak Spanish, I joined up with a law partner, Randy Estes, who was doing a lot of workers' compensation. And I said to him one day, look, it seems like a lot of the people who would be getting hurt at work are Spanish speakers, if not, a huge percentage of them in Louisiana. And so that has now evolved itself into a practice where I'd say half of our clientele speak Spanish. They're construction workers who got injured on the job and they don't speak English. They're here speaking Spanish, or they have a wage and hour claim, which is something else I'm sure we can get to. So that's been incredibly useful to me in my practice. And so those are kind of the two ways I would say that my experience as a police officer has led me to where I am today.
That's really interesting. About how much of the population in Tallahassee where you were when you first got this inkling to study Spanish and get engrossed in that, what's the percentage population there in Tallahassee? And then also, where is it about in Baton Rouge?
That was a good 20 years ago, Sam. I don't know. It was a growing population. So South Florida, of course, has a huge Hispanic population, and I think everyone knows that. North Florida is, especially the area around Tallahassee, I don't know how it is so much today, but at the time it was more like kind of being in South Alabama. You didn't have a whole lot of Spanish speakers, but it was a growing community. And one night I was called to the scene of a pretty violent crime, and I was just affected by and impacted by the fact that none of us could speak to the people who were desperate, who really needed our help at the time. And so it led me to go to the chief of police and kind of lay out a plan for learning Spanish and having the department help me with that. Here, I'd say we have between 40 and 70,000 people in the greater Baton Rouge area. But that percent, which is not a high percentage of the population, but when you start talking about construction workers and laborers, that percentage kind of shoots up as a percentage of the actual construction worker population. So here we have a very significant South Louisiana population with long standing connections to countries like Honduras, El Salvador, and of course, Mexico.
Great. Yeah. And tell me more about that, about the journeys you made and how your international relations background has really played into how you practice.
Well, I studied international relations in college, and largely because I was looking for something easier than engineering, which is what I started out as. So I ended up double majoring in history and international relations. And that, I guess it whetted my appetite for it and my interest in international cultures and foreign languages. I've studied to some degree or another Arabic, German, and Spanish, and particularly Spanish, which has been something that I've kind of undertaken as a lifelong endeavor to become fluent in Spanish. I do a Spanish call-in radio show here in Baton Rouge on Friday mornings. And at times I've done the same thing down in New Orleans. So I think that those areas of study certainly lent themselves to what I'm doing now, in the sense that it really piqued my interest in international cultures, Latin America in particular. I love it. My job has afforded me lots of opportunities to travel to every country in Central America over the last few years.
When you decided, or just eventually developed, practicing law involving wage and hour claims, was that something you chose, or is that something that was sort of revealed to you as you were trying to serve this population more?
Starting with doing workers' compensation cases, which is essentially workplace accidents, we found out pretty quickly that a lot of our Hispanic clientele were suffering various forms of employment abuses. They're being taken advantage of, not being paid overtime, not being paid, not having their wages calculated correctly. We handled a case for a group of visa workers who were here doing landscape working, where they were just not paid for 45 minutes to an hour and a half prior to each shift. They had to show up to the landscaping yard, prepare equipment, fuel their machinery, load things onto trucks, and then drive often as far as half an hour to an hour to their first job site. And none of that time was being compensated. We started realizing that it's not just the Hispanic community. Those things happen everywhere. And so we developed a little bit of a niche practice here in Baton Rouge of wage and hour claims, unpaid wages, overtime claims, any sort of wage docking claims where you're just not paid for all of your time. So I find all of those claims to be incredibly fascinating. And you're really, this is true for both workers' compensation and for wage claims. You're really helping someone who just really needs the thing they're after, whether it be medical care, weekly indemnity benefits while they can't work, or just the pay that they've earned. It's funny to hear some employers get angry about being sued for unpaid wages or overtime. But I say to the opposing counsel, my client already earned these wages. They've already worked. You just haven't paid them. So I find that wage and hour claims to be extraordinarily fulfilling and interesting.
I want to know more about the relationship that you've developed with your partner, Randy Estes, how that came to be, and getting into why you chose to specialize in wage and hour claims.
That's a timely question, because Randy and I just hit 10 years together as law partners. We started this firm in June of 2014. And so next month will be our 10-year anniversary as law partners. And I'd been practicing at a really big commercial litigation practice, a big firm in the southeast, mostly southeast United States, here in Louisiana. And then I left that practice to go in-house for a client. And as I was transitioning out of that, I was sharing some office space with another attorney in town. And I met Randy, and I was watching him handle something that I had never even thought about in the sense of my legal practice, which was workers' compensation, work accidents. I'd never seen anyone who just handled work accidents. I've done commercial litigation. I represent big companies. I get into contract disputes. And I just thought it is really different. There's nothing wrong at all. And it can be a super interesting job to represent big companies and to get into commercial litigation. I think commercial litigation is a really interesting field of legal practice. But I will say that I saw for the first time an attorney who was helping people who were really suffering, and individuals who maybe thought they couldn't be helped, or that they couldn't reach the result they needed to, or they were never going to be able to work at the same level that they could. And I thought that was fascinating. And I was sharing this space with him in another part of town here in Baton Rouge. And I just one day took him to lunch and I said, "Hey man, I speak Spanish. You don't know this about me, but I'm watching what you do. And it seems like we could have for lack of a better word, a sort of a symbiotic relationship. I don't know anything about workers' comp, but I do speak Spanish, and I'll bet we could go get a bunch of clients who probably think they can't even have a workers' comp claim." And that's what we found when we started. I started I got on the local Spanish radio at the time. It was on Wednesday afternoons. It was supposed to be a call-in radio show. And I'd been watching immigration attorneys do it on the same radio show, radio station. And they just get one call after another. And I wouldn't get any calls. I wouldn't get a single call. Sometimes someone would call and ask about immigration. But I found out after maybe the second week, they weren't calling the radio show because this was during the workday, and an injured worker is probably being dragged around some construction job site. His boss is 30 yards away. He can't call in and ask questions about his accident. But we would get just swamped with calls after the show. They'd call our office. If we were closed, they'd leave messages. And it's kind of stayed, as over the years, I've now done that show for 10 years. And people are more comfortable to call in. But at the time, at first we didn't think we were getting responses, but we really did get a great response. That's a long-winded way of saying I met Randy, saw what he was doing, and thought that my Spanish might add to the practice.
Well, I think it's great when you can find ways to complement others and work together and serve underserved communities.
I was just looking for the word, but we complement each other. That's a great way to put it.
And so thinking about workers' compensation, you mentioned how many people who may end up being injured in their workplace, they don't have time to try to figure these things out, what their benefits are, how to file a claim even, what all that means, how to navigate the legal system under that particular act. Given the complexities and the state-by-state differences with workers' compensation law, how do you ensure that your clients get their full benefits in Louisiana?
Well, a couple of ways. And that's a good question, because not only does workers' compensation change, or is it different from state to state, it changes within the state. We're right now, one of the things I'd have to say that we do is we are active with our state legislature, making sure that the laws make sense, because new legislators often, they want to propose changes for the sake of change. And when you're fiddling with a system like workers' compensation, one change to something that seems fairly innocuous can just have a domino effect. And so there's a couple of things we're doing. We're trying to stay on top of the current state of the law in Louisiana for workers' compensation, and we're trying to make sure those laws continue to operate in a common sense way. So we're active with the state legislature, but we also just finally, I think, maybe one of the most important things is just really getting to know the client. Every case is different. Every case has its own, complexity, unique issues that have to be addressed. So, yeah, from the beginning of each case, we're trying to make sure we understand everything that's going on, that we have a really good workup of the case and understand the client and what has happened from the client's point of view up to that point, and where the client wants to go, so that we can get there together.
What common misconceptions have you found with the people you work with when it comes to these types of cases?
Well, Sam, nowhere is that more true than in workers' compensation. Someone gets injured on the job and they're coming in to meet an attorney, and they have ideas about, you've seen it on TV. I'm going to get money for pain and suffering, for my lost time, for all of the medical expenses that I've gone through. Workers' compensation just doesn't work that way. Those are things that you can get in a tort case, a personal injury claim. And we do handle personal injury claims. And sometimes an accident can involve both a workers' compensation claim and a tort or personal injury claim. But generally, a work injury is just going to be a workers' compensation claim. And so one of the misconceptions that we have to explain to clients is that the workers' compensation insurer and the employer have two main obligations to the client. The first one is to provide them with medical care, provide and pay for and approve any necessary medical treatment, any physical therapy, any surgery, whatever it may be that the person needs that's related to that workplace accident. The second is that if the person can't work because of the accident, the insurer has to pay that person a weekly, it's called an indemnity benefit, but it's a weekly payment. It's a percentage of that person's pre-accident wage that they receive every week. And that can change over the course of a case. It can go from a weekly benefit for not being able to work at all to a monthly payment, a supplemental benefit for maybe being able to work, but not being able to earn quite as much as you could before the accident. That's probably the main thing we have to get across to most people, is that, because even I as an attorney, I find other practicing attorneys don't know much about workers' compensation. It's something you're only exposed to when you get into a workplace accident. So the average layperson doesn't know. They know they have a workers' comp case. They've heard of workers' comp, but they don't know exactly what that entails. So the first meeting with a client is going to involve a lot of communication in that regard.
What does that process usually look like when a person is trying to file their claim and work with you to do that?
Usually, when I'm meeting with a client for the first time, they've had the accident. They've probably been taken to a doctor, an occupational medicine clinic by the employer. And oftentimes they're a little frustrated with what's going on. And so what we're trying to do to begin the case is we're trying to get a good medical history of the person, find out exactly what happened, what kind of medical treatment do they really need. And we're not doctors, for sure. And I would never try to be the expert on that. But at the same time, what Louisiana law says is that a person who's injured on the job they legally get to choose their own treating physicians. And so in a general sense, I get to make sure that person, if it's an orthopedic injury, that they get to a good orthopedic surgeon. They get to pick if they have a preference of orthopedic surgeon, we send them to that person. If they don't know a specialist who would be treating the kind of injury that they've suffered, we can often make recommendations, help them do the research. And then the second thing is just trying to get a good idea of what this person does for a living. How do they earn their wages? What is it about this injury that might affect their ability to go back to the same job? Hopefully they can. The ideal workers' compensation case is, and the system is created to put people back to work. We want to get that person treating. We want to get them better. We want to get them back in the job, hopefully, that they want to return to. And if they can't, then we want to guide them each step of the way to make sure they do get every benefit that's available to them.
Tell me more about that. What strategies do you use to help maximize the benefits that your clients receive during this process?
There's two major things. The first is that we want to make sure that they're not getting a one-sided, employer-sided medical treatment. We want to make sure that they're seeing a doctor that is their doctor, not the employer's doctor. Someone who is only in the picture to make sure that they get better. And the second is to make sure that they are, if they're not able to work, that they're getting every penny available to them. It's very common that a person comes to us already with a workers' compensation case that started in the sense that they've been communicated to by an insurance company. They've given perhaps an interview to an adjuster, and they're starting to get a weekly check in the mailbox, and it's not the right amount. It's less than what they should be getting. And that, when you're already only getting a percentage, not 100%, you're getting generally 2/3 of your pre-accident earnings per week. It becomes really important that calculation be made accurately. So that's one of the things we do immediately is to make sure they're getting the right treatment and every penny each week that they should be getting under the Workers' Comp Act.
And you had mentioned earlier that you are actively involved with the state legislature to perhaps influence or at least stay up to date on how these laws are enacted and how it affects your work. Tell us more about what that means to be involved with the state legislature and how you stay up to date on these current laws.
Ideally, there's not a lot to do. We just had a legislative election a few months ago. And so we've got a new slate of legislators, a couple in the state legislature here in Baton Rouge, a couple in the Senate. And for whatever reason, and we haven't seen this for a few years, we've got some folks who are proposing, for lack of a better word, sweeping changes to the Louisiana Workers' Compensation Code. And so they'll propose things like, hey, one of the things that we have to work with is, the prices that physicians are paid to perform medical services that are going to be paid by a workers' compensation insurer. By law, workers' compensation insurers get to pay less. They have a agreed upon compensation schedule for any medical treatment that might become necessary. And so those prices, of course, insurers would like to pay less. Doctors would like to earn more. And depending on the state legislators' lobbyists, who's lobbying whom. They're trying to change currently, and we've had this come up in the state legislature. For example, one legislator is trying to tie the reimbursement rates for medical services to Medicare rates. And there's a lot of problems with that, one of which is the administrative cost that goes into a medical practice who is doing workers' compensation. And they have to do things to apply for approval for treatment that they would never be compensated for if it was purely tied to Medicare. So, that's one example. We see some changes coming possibly to the way indemnity rates, that weekly benefit, might be calculated. So we just keep an eye on things. If we see a law that would be obviously detrimental, then we're going to make phone calls to state legislators. We're going to go through lobbying organizations. I haven't done this yet, but I anticipate having to go down and maybe testify about my experience in workers' compensation and why a proposed legislative bill might not work as well as the person proposing it hopes.
Now, to wrap things up, Dan, I'd love to hear perhaps a challenging case or a case that you have really enjoyed working on where you got a favorable outcome for your client, and just walk us through that story.
I guess I could point to a lot of cases. I have a lot of interesting workers' compensation. I've got cases. I've got one that's taking me to Nicaragua next week. It's unfortunately a death case. And we get these from time to time as someone dies while they're employed here in Louisiana. But I guess the case I would probably look at as maybe the most interesting, complicated case is a fellow who was working on a farm, a sugarcane farm in Louisiana, and was in a tractor accident, and he lost his leg. This was a guy who called me. His employer picked him up after his leg was amputated, and he was in the hospital for days. Picked him up, put him in a motel, and had bought him a bus ticket to go back to Mexico, and told him that in Mexico he could get better medical benefits. And the guy just kind of took the employer at his word, but someone convinced him to call me, and we ended up taking care of him. He had a workers' compensation case. Of course, it's a workplace accident, but it turns out that the person who caused the accident was unrelated to the employer in such a way that we were able to, at the same time as we had a workers' compensation case, we were able to file suit against this other company that caused the accident in a personal injury case. So we had two cases going at the same time. And it took a few years, and it went all the way up to the federal Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal. I had to go argue some pretty interesting issues having to do with workers' compensation, because the company that we sued for the accident wanted it to be a workers' compensation case vis-a-vis them. They didn't want to be sued, in personal injury for all of the things that go along with that, pain and suffering, loss of enjoyment of life, of losing your limb. What might have been a case that, the workers' compensation side might have been worth a few $100,000. We ultimately ended up getting him the policy limits of that other company's insurance, which was $2.5 million. And that was a long journey for him. He's back living in Mexico, communicating all the time with us. And I really enjoyed that. It was an interesting journey.
This has been Workplace Justice with Dan Davis. I'm Sam Henninger. Remember to like, share, subscribe, because we'll continue to have great conversations just like this. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.